Good evening. Thank you for joining us for our Kol Nidrei services tonight. 10 days ago, we gathered for our Rosh Hashanah evening service. And just as it began, news began to spread about the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And her passing has had a huge impact on our country and on the Jewish community as well. She wasn't just a Supreme Court justice, she was a Jewish justice. Tonight, I want to reflect not on her death and what that means going forward. There's plenty of that. Rather, I want to pay tribute to her for all that she has done and to pay attention to her life that she lived. Because Justice Ginsburg was a role model in so many different ways. She was a role model to women and girls around the country and really around the world for her achievements, particularly coming at a time and in a culture that didn't see too many women achieve what she has achieved. She's also a role model and an inspiration for many in the Jewish community. Because for her, her Jewish identity wasn't just some footnote in her biography. It wasn't just some interesting note about her background or her parents' background. It was a part of who she was. Justice Ginsburg, if you've been reading some of the Jewish press about her, one of the reports was that she was the only Jewish justice who had the mezuzah on the doorposts leading into her office in the Supreme Court, a mezuzah which contained the words of the Shema, Shema Yisrael, hear Israel, the Eternal is your God, the Eternal is one. And that inside her office in the Supreme Court were words from the Torah, from the book of Deuteronomy that said, Tzedek, Tzedek tirdof, justice, justice you shall pursue. She wasn't just a Supreme Court justice, she was a Jewish one. This is what she had to write about it in 1996 in an essay for the American Jewish Committee. She said, quote, I am a judge, born, raised, and proud of being a Jew. The demand for justice runs through the entirety of the Jewish tradition. I hope in my years on the bench of the Supreme Court of the United States, I will have the strength and courage to remain constant in the service of that demand. I think that's absolutely so wonderful. For many people, being Jewish could mean all sorts of different things, but for Justice Ginsburg, part of what makes her a Jewish role model is the fact that she took Jewish teachings, what she considered to be the core of Judaism, its pursuit of justice, its concern for justice, and brought that with her into her everyday life, into her profession, into her calling as a judge in justice. And she's right. No matter what you think of her interpretations of it all, her concern for justice, her concern for fairness, that is something that comes out of the Jewish tradition. And for that to have been her motivation, part of her motivation, well, that's what makes her a role model. That's what makes her worthy of being talked about, both in the synagogue and especially on Yom Kippur as well, this holiest day of the year. We don't get too many examples like her. She's what I would call a Gidolah Bador, a giant of her generation. She's a giant of her generation because of all the obstacles that she had to overcome, of which much has been made. Her challenges on account of her being of her gender that people put in front of her and said, because you are a woman, you can't do X, Y, or Z, and she proved them wrong. As a law student, as an attorney, as a judge, and a justice. She achieved and accomplished so much. But being Jewish was also a big part of who she was, a big part that animated her. I read recently that her granddaughter referred to her as Babi, the Yiddish term for grandma. Her Judaism was both intellectual and inspirational, and also just a regular part of how she went about her life and in her family as well. I read something interesting that she wrote 5 years ago. She co-authored with a local rabbi, a Devar Torah, a short Torah teaching, a word of Torah. And it was all about Passover and the Passover story. The Passover story, the way it's normally told, is a story about Pharaoh enslaving the Israelites and then God calling on Moses to confront Pharaoh saying, let my people go, and you know the story. But actually, the story of the telling doesn't often include 5 really brave and courageous people that's in the original Torah. These 5 brave and courageous people might not have been Moses, who was called upon by God, but in some ways they came to the right conclusion all on their own. These were 5 women who all did the right thing despite difficult circumstances and an unfair and an unjust world. These 5 women were Hebrew midwives who disobeyed Pharaoh when Pharaoh said, "Drown the Hebrew babies," Shifra and Puah. These 5 women include Moses' mother and sister Yocheved and Miriam, who worked to save Moses' life because all Hebrew babies were ordered to be killed. And they include, those 5 Hebrew women, Pharaoh's own daughter who rescued Moses, adopted him, brought him into the royal palace, and raised him up. These 5 women were heroes of the story because of their courage, because they did the right thing despite the fact that they were never called upon by God from a burning bush. They were never given that kind of backup, that kind of push to do the right thing. They did it all on their own. They courageously stood up for what was right, despite the fact that the right thing was also the harder thing, the more difficult thing. Here's what Ruth Bader Ginsburg had to say. Quote, "Pharaoh's daughter Batia defied her own father and plucked baby Moses out of the Nile. The Midrash reminds us that Batia knew exactly what she was doing. When Pharaoh's daughter's handmaidens saw that she intended to rescue Moses, they attempted to dissuade her and persuade her to heed her father. They said to her, 'Our mistress, it is the way of the world that when a king issues a decree, it is not heeded by the entire world, but his children and the members of his household do observe it. And you wished to transgress your father's decree?' But transgress she did. These women had a vision leading out of darkness shrouding their world. They were women of action, prepared to defy authority, to make their vision a reality, bathed in the light of the day." End quote. Those were the words of Justice Ginsburg. In so many ways, those words could have applied to Justice Ginsburg herself. She had a vision that didn't comport to the reality around her. The reality around her was most women never had the opportunity to do certain things. But she said there's nothing about being a woman that should hold her back or any other woman. That she was as smart as and as capable as any man. And she was right. And she achieved so much. But not only did she achieve so much, she did it at a time when others weren't able to do it because of what society and our culture was saying about women and their place. But she had courage, she had tenacity, she had resolve. She overcame and she achieved. Here's another thing about what she did that I think is so appropriate for us to talk about on Yom Kippur. What she did was she looked at the past with all of its restraints that it put on women and the present, her present. And she said, just because things have always been that way doesn't mean they have to be that way in the future. The future can be different than the past. The future doesn't have to be limited by the present. Those limitations, they can be overcome. And she led the way to do it. She achieved both for herself, but she didn't just achieve for herself. Her achievements were America's achievements. Because they shattered glass ceilings, they opened up opportunities, and she became an example to so many people. People who can aspire to do something that's never been done before or rarely been done before. She demonstrated courage that, yes, helped to propel her own career and her own place in the legal profession, but also, along the way, to open up opportunities for so many other people who might not have had those opportunities were it not for her. You know, so much of our Jewish tradition talks about how we need to constantly do better and better and better and better, and that's why Yom Kippur is the holiest day of the year. Because it's on this day that we look at opportunities that might exist for improvement, and we commit ourselves to pursuing them. We look at the past and we say that's not supposed to just be a limitation. The past doesn't have to hold us back, that we can progress into the future. That we can look back and say, you know what, there might have been something wrong about the way things have been done, whether ways that we've been doing things or our community is doing things or our culture has told us is the right way to do it. It might be the wrong thing and we can do better. That's what she said. She's right. We have role models in our tradition, aside from Justice Ginsburg, who took the same approach. One of them was Abraham. Abraham grew up the son of an idol maker. His dad made statues that people prayed to. And Abraham and Sarah together started the Jewish people, bringing to the world faith in one God, despite the fact that his own dad made idols. Abraham smashed the idols of the past, and in doing so, brought forward the Jewish faith. Justice Ginsburg smashed and took a hammer to the idolatry of sexism, the idolatry of false limitations on people, so that people might flourish to the best of their ability, so that people wouldn't be held back by these false ceilings placed upon them. She carried on in the tradition of Abraham. She carried on in the tradition of those women that she wrote about. Women who transgressed the wrong thing. Women who were willing to stand up. People who were willing to stand up and challenge the status quo. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a justice, but she's also a Jew in the best possible way. There's another point about Justice Ginsburg that's been talked about a lot recently and that I want to mention again here tonight. And that is about her friendship with Justice Antonin Scalia. Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg both operated different ideological positions on the Supreme Court. She was considered to be one of the leading liberals of the court. He was considered to be one of the leading conservatives of the court. Both of them very resolute in their beliefs and their opinions and their philosophies. Nevertheless, they didn't just tolerate one another with a friendly hello. They were very good, close friends. Their families were very close with one another. They cared deeply for one another. Their friendship existed despite the fact that their intellectual positions were at such odds with one another. And particularly at this time in our country, when it feels like that different sides just can't get along, Justice Ginsburg and Justice Scalia at least offered an example for how that might be. That at the one time, they didn't have to give up their own intellectual and ideological commitments. They didn't have to give up their ideals. They didn't have to give up their way of thinking. And yet, at the same time, they could respect and even have a friendship with somebody who thought differently from themselves. And they could do that, I think, because they respected the fact that the other person acted out of the best of their intentions. Just because we disagree with a person doesn't mean that that person doesn't have good intentions. And that's important. It's not to say everybody has the best of intentions, though. I'm reminded of another Jewish teaching about something called a machloket l'shem shamayim, a disagreement for the sake of heaven. Jewish tradition teaches that there's two kinds of arguments, just two. Disagreements not for the sake of heaven and disagreements for the sake of heaven. Sometimes people disagree, and when they disagree, what they're pursuing isn't what they think is right. They pursue what they think is going to benefit them the most, what they think might give them the most power. Our tradition cites as an example the biblical figure of Korach. Korach challenged Moses not because he thought Moses was wrong, because Moses had power and he didn't, and he wanted that power. Nevertheless, despite the fact, I should say, that Moses only had his power because God wanted him to, because Moses was using his power to challenge Pharaoh over slavery. But Korach didn't have any grand ideal that he wanted to pursue and therefore have power in order to achieve it. He simply wanted to be the one in charge. His arguments that he raised against Moses, no matter how good they might have looked on paper, were arguments not for the sake of heaven, because he actually didn't really care, so long as he was the one in charge. There's a different kind of argument, though, an argument that is for the sake of heaven. These arguments are the sort that two 2,000-year-old rabbinic sages would have, Hillel and Shammai. Hillel and Shammai disagreed about absolutely everything. One would say left, the other would say right. One would say up, the other one would say down. Everything they disagreed about. And yet both of them came to their conclusions. Both of them arrived to where they were because they thought that it was the right thing, not just for themselves, but really for the community as a whole. Justice Ginsburg and Justice Scalia, I think, were the same way. And they knew that about each other, and they respected that about each other. Their writings and what their families have said, they never really thought that they could ever persuade the other to come around to their way of thinking. That was perhaps a fool's errand for them. But nevertheless, they shared many other things in common. Love of going to opera, friendship between the two of them, their families as well, and a recognition of the basic decency within one another and the humanity within one another. And that perhaps was enough, more than enough, for them to be close friends. And I admire and I respect Justice Ginsburg and Justice Scalia for that friendship that they had between the two of them. Justice Ginsburg offers us so many positive examples, so many things worth remembering on this Yom Kippur. Her own achievements, her challenges to the past and to the status quo, her ability to transcend ideological differences with people and to build and nurture relationships and friendships through which she lived her life and enjoyed her life. Zichrona livracha, may her memory be for a blessing, and may her memory be for an inspiration as well. May the memory of the righteous be for a blessing. Amen.